I'm very excited to talk about my ongoing PhD research, which is on early Jurassic insects with you all this evening. So just to add on to what Ben said there, just a very quick personal introduction and an overview of how I became to where I am now as a paleontologist. So I received a first-class Bachelor of Science degree in paleontology from the University of Portsmouth in 2018, and that's in the UK, in which my undergraduate thesis investigated the taphonomy, so the preservation of ammonites, which are a type of extinct marine mollusk from the Lower Jurassic of Whitby, which is in Yorkshire in the UK. I then undertook a standalone one-year master's degree at the University of Manchester, which I finished in 2020, and received an MPhil in paleontology for a thesis that focused on a revision of the large early Jurassic ichthyosaur, which is a type of marine reptile known as Temnodontosaurus crassimanus, which is also from the Lower Jurassic of Whitby in Yorkshire. And this research formed the basis of my first lead author scientific paper. I'm currently a second year PhD research student at the Open University based in Milton Keynes in the UK, funded by NERC through the Centre Doctoral Training Partnership. And like I said, my PhD project is focused on, of course, early Jurassic insects. And most recently, in August 2021, I was part of a small team which excavated the largest, most complete marine reptile skeleton ever unearthed in Britain. And this was found at the Rutland Water Nature Reserve, which is in the Midlands in the UK. And I was involved with this project as this ichthyosaur most likely belongs to the species Temnodontosaurus trilodon, which is a sister taxon to Temnodontosaurus crassimanus, a cousin, if you like, which is a species I revised during my master's degree. So nevertheless, all of my research has focused on early Jurassic, actually specifically Toarcian faunas, going from marine invertebrates with the ammonites to marine vertebrates and the ichthyosaurs, and now on to studying terrestrial invertebrates with the insects for my PhD. So I really want to talk to you today about my PhD research, which is looking at the effects of the early Jurassic extreme environmental change on insects. But what does this involve exactly? Well, first we need to look at present day insects. They really are the small organisms that run the world. In fact, insects are the most diverse group of terrestrial organisms in the history of life and are a central component of the living world. Now, these animals are extremely adaptable and form part of almost every habitat and niche on Earth. And they are incredibly crucial in ecosystem functioning. They help to cycle nutrients, pollinate plants, disperse seeds, and also provide a major food source for other taxa. And I've included a few examples here of certain roles that insects fill in certain ecosystems. And currently, over half of all described species of living organisms on Earth are actually insects. In fact, there are 1.4 billion insects per person on this planet. Now, recent studies estimate that worldwide, there are approximately 6 million species of insects. However, only 20% of these have been described by science and named. So there's still a lot that we don't know about insects. So Hexapoda, which are six-legged arthropods, is a subphylum which includes the insects. And this subphylum is thought to currently possess approximately 29 orders of true insects. However, just 4 of these orders, which I've popped on the screen there, so we have the Coleoptera, which are the beetles, Diptera, which are flies, Hymenoptera, which are wasps and bees, and Lepidoptera, which of course butterflies and moths. Just these 4 orders here account for at least 80% of all described species of living insects, meaning the other 25% of true insects account for only 20% of all described species. So just these 4 orders alone really do dominate the planet. Now, the Hexapoda, so again, the 6-legged arthropods, are amongst the oldest known terrestrial organisms, and the oldest known examples of which are from the Devonian, so approximately 400 million years ago, from the Devonian of Rhynie in Scotland in the UK, from a deposit known as the Rhynie Chert. Now, on the screen there in the top right, I've included a picture of a hand specimen highly polished of the rhyniid shirts. And then below is a zoomed in picture of some of the primitive hexapods that have been found from this deposit. However, recent phylogenetic dating does suggest that insects first appeared during the Silurian or even the Ordovician alongside first land plants, so even older than this Devonian rhyniid shirt, making them amongst the earliest land animals to occupy the planet. Now, insects are generally among the best preserved terrestrial fossil organisms, in fact, much more complete than vertebrates, and are also found much more frequently. And this is because they don't get as disarticulated or broken up and are often smaller in size. Now, the Hexapoda record for the Devonian period is very scarce, with only approximately 6 wingless fossils described, whilst there actually hasn't been any fossil insects described from the early Carboniferous. However, during the late Carboniferous, the insect diversity exploded, and things get very interesting. So approximately 300 million years ago, we saw insects flourish with what looked like a sudden appearance of winged insects, which also had very diverse feeding resources, so carnivores, herbivores, and detritivores. And without a doubt, the most popular fossil insects from the Paleozoic are the giant Meganeuridae, which although superficially look like dragonflies, are more like griffin flies. And these flying insects had very large wingspans of up to 70 centimeters wide. And like today's dragonflies, had evolved very large eyes relative to their body size, as you can see on the image in the top right there. And of course, these were incredibly useful to scout out their prey. And these insects lived near the edges of bodies of water, such as streams and ponds, and they were carnivores, so fed upon other insects or small amphibians. And they used their long spine-covered legs to grab a hold of their prey. And besides these Meganeuridae, other insects were also very large during the Carboniferous, including cockroaches. So the question is, why could these animals grow so large during this time? Well, this gigantism has long been explained by the high percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere during this time, which is twice the current level what we have today, so around 40%, which would have favoured the physiology of flight during this period. However, other theories have been put forward based on more ecological factors, so including the absence of flying predatory vertebrates at this time, which also would explain why these insects were able to get to these large sizes. So while there's some controversy that still remains on why these insects were so large, I think it's important to consider both of these hypotheses. Now, evidence for modern day anthropogenically driven, so human driven climate change is overwhelming. And the overuse of fossil fuels as energy resources has led to an increased concentration of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane, into the atmosphere, which has caused the average surface temperature of the Earth to increase. Now, historical record and ongoing research has already documented significant evidence for climate change, including increased ocean and atmosphere temperatures, eustatic sea level rise, land ice volume reduction and global glacier decline, increased concentration of these greenhouse gases, and ocean deoxygenation and ocean acidification. Now, a report by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, so IPCC, in 2021 discussed how the Earth is changing. And this report revealed that in 2019, atmospheric CO2, so atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, were higher than at any time in at least 2 million years. And it was also determined in this report that global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years, which is highlighted on the graph on the right there. So there really is no denying that human influence has warmed the atmosphere and oceans, and that modern day global warming is significantly altering ecosystems and biodiversity at an unprecedented rate and scale. So this global biodiversity crisis is already including widespread species extinctions, with animal species now estimated to be disappearing at rates that are 1,000 times faster than those observed in the fossil record. And studies also estimate that at least 1 million species are facing extinction in the coming decades, and sadly, approximately half of which will be insects. So this poses the question, why are insects so vulnerable to climate change? Well, whilst insects have thrived and diversified through millions of years of Earth's variable climate, rapid increase in global temperature, combined with other anthropogenic pressures, or human pressures, including habitat loss, definitely poses new challenges to insects. And many species of insects are potentially highly vulnerable and responsive to the impacts of climate change. And this is because many of these organisms are temperature dependent, for example, in respects to their life cycles and development time. And temperature changes due to global warming actually may induce changes in things like life cycle duration, the ability to produce an abundant offspring, for example, the number of broods or generations an organism can have in a year, and other things like population density, size, and genetic composition. So temperature changes can really have a big effect on these insects. Now, a recent study concluded that over 40% of all insects are actually declining, and a third are in danger. Now, this data suggests that the rate of decline is at least 2.5% per year. And in terrestrial ecosystems, the Lepidoptera, which are the butterflies and moths, Hymenoptera, which include the wasps and bees, and dung beetles, particularly within the Coleoptera, appear to be the taxa most affected. Now, I've included a graph on the right there that shows the rate of decline in terrestrial taxa, and this one here, which also shows the same rate of decline in aquatic taxa. Now, the main drivers of species decline appears to be habitat loss, pollution, including the use of pesticides, fertilizers, certain biological factors like the introduction of new species, and of course, the big one, which is climate change. And despite their importance within ecosystems, research into insects has been somewhat neglected. And I often find that insects are somewhat underappreciated and quite often overlooked. For example, in recent years, there's been a huge focus on birds and mammals, which are of course still incredibly important, but considerably less focus on insects. And the associated effects of current climate change on these terrestrial invertebrates is still quite unclear and has been identified as an urgent priority for future research. And as so few insect populations have been studied, like I previously said, that there's millions of species and there's still a lot that we've never described or named. Exact figures on insect decline for many insect orders is actually quite difficult to determine. And ultimately, there's still a lot that we don't know about how climate change is and actually will affect insects in the future. So Earth's history is interspersed with extreme and rapid climatic warming events. And these are often referred to as what we call hyperthermals. So these episodes of abrupt global warming, which are preserved in the geological record. And most hyperthermals were associated with significant environmental changes on both in the oceans and in the biosphere, causing mass extinctions and long-term ecological and biotic effects. And these past hyperthermal events are considered to be an analogue for potential extreme anthropogenic global warming, so the global warming that's happening now. And through exploring past periods of extreme environmental change, we can improve our understanding of patterns of ecosystem dynamics and how animals, like insects, respond to climate change through time. We can then possibly take this further to significantly enhance our understanding of how climate change is currently affecting modern day insect communities, and potentially even learn how to mitigate the loss of biodiversity in the future. Of course, in addition to furthering our understanding of how the Earth system can recover from such extreme environmental change. So the Mesozoic era, approximately 250 to 64 million years ago, witnessed 8 prolonged intervals of severe environmental change, referred to as an Oceanic Anoxic event. So what is an Oceanic Anoxic event? Well, it's a complex event characterized by the global deposition of organic rich marine sediments, and is also associated with the widespread or oceanic anoxia, major disturbances in the global carbon cycle, and global temperature increase. This is most likely caused by carbon release and obviously an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And without a doubt, one of the most significant periods of extreme environmental change in the Jurassic period occurred during the early Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic event. So I referred to the Toarcian a few times now, but as you can see on this geological chart on the right here, it's a stage in the Lower Jurassic which spans between 182.7 million years and 174.1 million years. So the Toarcian event, which occurred right at the start of this stage, was a sudden and severe global event of extreme environmental change, and is actually recognized as one of the most significant and intense environmental perturbations in the geological record. And the Toarcian event and the associated global changes of the early Jurassic environment actually has been extensively studied over the past 3 decades, with a particular interest focused on unraveling the cause or causes and consequences of the event and its effect on biodiversity. And as the Toarcian event is an example of extreme environmental change that occurred in response to the significant release of carbon into the ocean atmosphere system, this event is again considered a great analogue for potential extreme anthropogenic global warming. In fact, the scale of the changes observed in the Toarcian event is comparable with the IPCC global surface temperature change prediction for 2100. And so the Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic event was associated with many global changes during the early Jurassic, including global temperature rise of approximately 7 to 10 degrees, large quantities of carbon dioxide and most likely methane released into the oceans and atmosphere, an increase in continental chemical weathering, which might have actually helped to draw down some of the CO2 from the atmosphere, oceanic anoxia, so the global deposition of organic rich marine sediments, which are thought to have occurred during the event, are thought to reflect the widespread development of poor oxygenation in the oceans. There was also major eustatic sea level rise, most likely caused by thermal seawater expansion in response to global warming. So the global warming in effect was expanding the seawater. And also biotic crisis for both marine and terrestrial animals, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. But there's no doubt that the Earth was definitely experiencing great climatic unrest during this time. So the Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic event is marked by a phase of extensive organic-rich sedimentation within several basins across Northern Europe. And these sediments consist of laminated, organic-rich mud rocks. And so the burial of carbon associated with the deposition of organic-rich sediments actually records a pronounced negative carbon isotope excursion. So essentially a shift in the carbon isotope ratio. And I've highlighted it on this image there. So you can see there's a definite shift within the Toarcian. And this negative shift was caused by a relatively rapid release of thousands of gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, and is actually now regarded as a well-documented feature and actually a stratigraphic marker of the Toarcian interval. And this negative carbon isotope excursion has been observed worldwide. So in Europe, including Luxembourg itself, Asia, North and South America, and Africa. However, the majority of the really high resolution studies of this event have been undertaken at the European localities. So the extreme environmental change associated with the early Toarcian had severe effects on the biosphere, including a second-order extinction of many marine fauna. So organisms affected included foraminifera, which are a type of microscopic single-celled organism, ostracods, which are a type of crustacean, ammonites, which are again extinct marine mollusks, which is pictured there on the screen, brachiopods and bivalves, so the shelled marine invertebrates, and actually ichthyosaurs, which are marine reptiles. And the Toarcian event and associated mass extinction is actually quite well studied in the marine realm, with the mass extinction interval in the ocean observed to last around 100 million years. Now, in 1995, Benton documented a 5% marine extinction, but actually documented a 2.4 to 12.8% extinction among terrestrial organisms in the Toarcian. However, the extinction is less understood in the continental realm, in contrast to the marine, even though the extinction may have actually been more severe on land. So the Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic event had severe effects on terrestrial plant life. We know this, including rapid changes in diversity and composition of vegetation, which were, like I said, regarded as more rapid than the paleoecological changes that have been recorded in the marine realm during this event. Now, through analysis of spores and pollen assemblages from trees, from the early Jurassic strata in, again, Yorkshire in the UK, it was actually determined that during the event, the vegetation shifted from a high diversity assemblage to a more low diversity assortment of plants, including conifers and cycads, which are actually more adapted to survive warmer, drought-like conditions. And it shows this quite nicely on the image on the slide there. You see a transition into the more hot temperatures and a definite transition within the vegetation, both before, during, and after the Toarcian event. And these ecological changes observed within the terrestrial flora were attributed to greenhouse gas-induced global warming. And it's also been suggested that mercury, which derived from volcanism, which was occurring during this time, could also have actually been toxic to many plant species. And so, of course, you have to think about the animals that rely on this vegetation. And the short-term reduction in floral richness and diversity, in addition to this potential toxicity from volcanism, may have also had significant effects on herbivorous insects that would have fed upon them. And so, despite that the geological record for the early Toarcian contains a number of fossil insect beds, the link between the occurrence of these insect beds, changes in plants, and key stages in the climatic change during the Toarcian has yet to be explored. So that's really where my PhD fits in. So we're wanting to take a closer look at the insects during the Toarcian to see how they were affected by this extreme environmental change. But where do we need to look for the fossils? Well, first, let's look at an overview of what Earth would have looked like during the early Jurassic. So as you can see here, this is a paleogeographic map of the early Jurassic period, approximately 180 million years ago. And the early Jurassic period witnessed the continued breakup of this large supercontinent Pangaea, resulting in separation of Gondwana, which are the lower continents, and Laurasia, which are the upper continents, and which also coincided with the opening of the southern Atlantic Ocean, which you can see there. And the red box I've placed on here highlights the position of Europe at this time. And I've highlighted this because the lower Toarcian strata of Middle Europe and the UK has produced thousands of well-preserved insect specimens. And this material is arguably one of the most important Mesozoic faunas in the world. So let's take a closer look at Europe during this time. So during the early Jurassic, the area of Europe was situated between the paleolatitudes 30 to 45 degrees north of the equator. So modern day latitude of the UK is about 55 degrees. So we were a lot closer to the equator during the early Jurassic. And Europe at this time occupied a key position in the epicontinental seaway. And due to higher sea level, there were only several minor islands that dotted the shallow seaway. And you can see these highlighted on this image in the orangey colour there. And we didn't have the full extent of what we know as to be the UK and mainland Europe today. These black outlines are just to really give an idea of where we're looking in the world. And all of the Toarcian insect material that we have from Central Europe originated from these surrounding mainlands or offshore islands. But we'll discuss how they ended up in these marine sediments shortly. And so this map highlights the locations of all of the Toarcian insect-bearing localities in Europe, from localities in northern and southern Germany, Switzerland, of course, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the UK. And it also indicates what sediments the insect material is preserved in. So you can see the majority of these localities are preserved in these bituminous sediments, so the characteristic sediments of the Toarcian events, these organic rich mud rocks. However, there's some localities in northern Germany where things are a little bit different, and these insects are actually preserved in something called the green series clay. And it's these couple of these localities in northern Germany that have yielded a particularly rich Toarcian entomofauna. So let's have a look at one of these localities in detail. So a disused clay mine situated near Grimmen in northern Germany has yielded a rich insect fauna of over 3,000 specimens. Now, the insects from this locality derive from a formation referred to, like I mentioned, as the green series formation, which is comprised of green to grey plastic clay and sits on top of these bituminous shells of the Posidonia shell formation, which you can see on this generalised log on the left here. And the green series clay has been extensively deformed by Pleistocene glaciers, so obviously considerably after its deposition during the Jurassic period. And this actually means that the section is unable to be studied accurately. However, this log, like I mentioned, just provide a generalized profile of the sediments at this location. And so the insects from this locality usually occur in the upper flat kidney-shaped calcareous nodules, as pictured here, which are approximately 1 to 10 centimeters in length. But insect remains, particularly isolated beetle forewings, have also been found in a considerable less degree in these lower yet larger nodules. And these nodules, like I mentioned, are slightly larger than the upper ones at around 20 to 40 centimeters in length and approximately 15 centimeters thick. But as I've highlighted on the paleogeographic map that I showed you a few slides ago, there are many other localities in Germany which yield Toarcian insects, in addition to Grimmen, as I've just mentioned, and I've listed a few on this slide here. But altogether, these German localities have produced a very rich and diverse assemblage of quite well-preserved insects. And I've included a couple of pictures on this slide from Ansel 2003. And you can clearly see some really nice examples of isolated wings and even some examples of more complete insects. And these insects here are represented by over 4,800 specimens and actually 21 individual insect orders. So an extremely diverse assemblage. Now, like Germany, the entomofauna of Luxembourg is exceptionally rich and diverse. And many insects have been reported from different localities in Luxembourg, as highlighted on this map here with the red stars, including the best known site, the Basserage area. And most recently, in 2018, new insect material was discovered in Sanem during the construction of a prison in the area. And we will discuss the material in the further slides. And the lowest Jurassic sediments, which outcrop in the southern part of Luxembourg, consist of these, again, bituminous shales, which are characteristic of the Toarcian. And at all of the insect-bearing sites, the insects are found in a flat, laminated, lenticular limestone, known as the limestone bed, which is highlighted on the stratigraphic log on the right there. And this limestone formed at an early diagenetic stage, so right at the beginning of the process from turning from sediment into rock, which actually allowed the preservation of these incredibly delicate insects. And of course, apart from the insect remains within this limestone, this deposit has also yielded many marine organisms, including rarer cephalopods, arthropods, small fishes, the occasional marine reptile, and more rarer land plants. So here's a pie chart which shows the overall general diversity of insects from the Toarcian material that was collected through from the Sanem locality in 2018 during the construction of the prison. And as you can see here, there are at least 14 individual orders of insects, which is slightly less in contrast to the 21 orders from the German deposits, but nevertheless still really diverse. So over the next few slides, I just want to go over some of these different insect orders, especially orders that make up a large proportion of this material, to really get an idea of what sort of insects were around in the Toarcian and kind of build up a picture of an insect community, and to also highlight how these insects are preserved. So just a quick word on the preservation of these insects. So when, of course, we think of insects preserved from the Jurassic period, some people might presume they're found in amber, like the famous mosquitoes from Jurassic Park. However, this is not the case with our insects from the Toarcian. In fact, amber preservation first became common in the earliest Cretaceous, so after the Jurassic period. In fact, the insects from the Toarcian are mostly preserved as compression fossils, so where the insect, or at least part of the insect, was physically compressed during the compaction of the surrounding sediment in the fossilization process. Now, chitin, which makes up part of the insect's cuticle, or an exoskeleton, is actually quite a durable material. And so when the rest of the insect body has decayed, these chitinous components and organic matter will often remain behind. Now, depending on how fine or coarse the sediment comprising the fossil is, dictates on how the insect will be preserved. So the general trend is the finer the sediment, the better preservation will be. Now, some of the Toarcian insect material, particularly some of the beetles, including the image in the top right-hand side there, are actually preserved in 3 dimensions, indicating that early diagenesis and cementation of the concretion which it was found in happened before the compaction of the surrounding sediment. So in most cases, only isolated wings are preserved, and as most of these insects were obviously washed in from these various islands, which we spoke about earlier, and would have obviously got disarticulated and broken up in the process. Or they would, for example, have landed on the ocean surface after flying out and getting lost at sea, or potentially getting blown in by the wind, and they would have started to have decomposed on the ocean surface. And the more complete specimens are often found in the more near-shore localities, like Dobbertin and Grimmen in Germany. But you can still find some really nice examples at the other localities, for example, the one on the left here from Sanem. But it is important to bear in mind that these insect communities are not strictly a true representation of what individual insect communities were during the Toarcian, as these insects were again washed in from land, and therefore the formation of these so-called assemblages are actually controlled by various preservational processes. For example, some insects will preserve better than others. But it does still give us a really good snapshot of the insect communities during this time and how diverse they actually were. So let's take a closer look at some different insect orders represented by the Luxembourg material starting with the most abundant. So one of the most common insect fossils collected from the new Sanem location are the Ordinata, so the dragonflies. And they're easily one of the most iconic and most recognizable fossil insects. And this is due to their delicate yet detailed membranous wings. And you can clearly see the complex wing venations on this fossil specimen here. And these venations are actually veins that cover the entire wing in a sort of geometric pattern and essentially support the wing for the insect. And what's interesting about these venations is they can often be used as ways of differentiating between otherwise similar species of insects. And this is not just the case for dragonflies, but this is quite useful when we're dealing with fossil remains which are quite disarticulated and the rest of the insect is just not preserved, which, like I mentioned, is often the case, as isolated wings are the most common within these Toarcian deposits. Now, after the dragonflies, we have the Orthopteras, so grasshoppers, which are again one of the more common fossils collected from the recent material in Luxembourg. And again, you can see with this fossil forewing on the left here, also referred to as a tegmen, it has incredible detail and wing coloration, and doesn't actually look that much different from modern day grasshoppers, like the example on the right there, a modern grasshopper. And grasshoppers actually had two pairs of wings, but unlike the hind wings, which are a lot wider and membranous, the forewings of grasshoppers are more sclerotized, so they're toughened or hardened, which of course provides strength for the animal. And as you can see, these forewings actually do preserve quite well within these Toarcian deposits. And now what's also interesting is that we can also find the isolated hind legs of orthopterans in these deposits of Europe. And as you can see on the modern day representative on the right there, the hind legs of these organisms are quite enlarged and obviously highly specialized to allow these animals to leap long distances. So it's quite interesting that we can also find these preserved within the fossil record. So Coleoptera, so the beetles, are again well represented at the Sanem material. And these organisms are extremely recognizable by their modified hardened forewings, which are referred to as elytra. Now, these fossilized elytra are often found isolated in these Toarcian deposits, just like the membranous wings, and often sometimes retain their grooves or furrows or pits, which are these markings that cover the outer side of the wing. And you can see these both on the fossil example on the left there and the modern day example on the right. And the adaptation of these hardened forewings, so these elytra in the beetles, is actually often regarded as one of the most important factors to explain the great diversity and abundance of beetles at present day. And this is because these elytra protect the underneath membranous hind wings and abdomen from things like mechanical damage, predators, excessive water loss, and actually other environmental stresses and factors thought to potentially restrict other insects. So therefore, Coleoptera might be abundant in these Toarcian deposits, as perhaps they were able to adapt and thrive during this associated extreme environmental change. However, the high abundance of Coleoptera in these Toarcian deposits actually could also be due to taphonomic, so preservational processes, as these beetle elytra are actually quite robust than obviously membranous forewings, and therefore could be better preserved, or will be better preserved within the fossil record. So the hemipterans, which are referred to as the true bugs, include insects like aphids and leafhoppers. And as an order, they're again quite abundant in Toarcian deposits, as observed at the Sanem locality. And the high proportion of these phytophagous insects, so basically insects that feed on green plants within Toarcian deposits, actually suggests that there must have been a high abundance of terrestrial flora on the mainlands and islands in Europe during this time, in order to support such large insect communities. Now, on the left here is an example of another isolated wing, which is belongs to a genus of plant hopper from the Toarcian. And as you can see, it's actually quite similar to the modern day representative, so this brown plant hopper on the right there. And plant hoppers are laterally flattened and hold their very broad wings quite vertically in a sort of tent-like fashion on their backs there, which help to conceal their sides. So you can see they're strikingly similar between the Toarcian fossil and the modern day representative. So the insect order Neuroptera, so also referred to as the netwing insects, are also relatively abundant in the Toarcian of Sanem. In fact, these organisms continue to diversify through the entirety of the Mesozoic era. And adult Neuroptera have 4 membranous wings, which are all roughly the same size. And these membranous wings contain many veins, which are again these supporting structures that run through the wing. And you can see very faintly on this fossil example, these very thin venations which run throughout the wing. And one extinct family of Neuroptera, referred to as the Coleoptera, are often referred to as the butterflies of the Jurassic, as they possess these large forewings, which grow to excess of 160 millimeters long. And most of these insects actually possess an eye spot on the fore and hind wings, by which they actually superficially resemble some modern day butterflies. In fact, in 2020, Ansog and McCorkin described the oldest example of this from the Lower Jurassic of Germany. And as you can see here by the pictures on the slide, these specimens here have beautiful characteristic eye spots on their wings. And when you can compare it with the modern day representative on the right there, you can see how they really do resemble modern day butterflies. For example, with this owl butterfly, which also has these large eye spots resembling the eyes of owls. So, although many insects are simply termed flies, only those that have one pair of wings are what we call true flies and therefore belong within the order Diptera. Now, Diptera are fairly well represented in the Toarcian of not just Luxembourg, but in other European localities, and especially as either isolated forewings, like the example we have here, or as actually wingless isolated bodies. And in fact, the Dipteran wings in these Toarcian deposits can be incredibly small and in fact quite easily missed. And they're at sizes even below 4 millimeters in length. And this particular genus of Diptera on the left there from Sanem, Hemiptera, is actually a type of crane fly. It's somewhat similar to the modern day representative on the right there, which possesses quite a slender body and these stick-like legs resembling an oversized mosquito. So cockroaches are insects of the order Blattodea and are again fairly well represented within the Toarcian. However, the cockroach diversity of these European early Toarcian sites is actually considered to be quite low. And these animals are again mainly represented by isolated wings and wing fragments, as highlighted by this fossil fragment here of a wing of the Coleoptera on the left. And while the hind wings of cockroaches are membranous, the forewings of cockroaches are actually quite leathery in texture and possess these clear venations, as you can see on the modern day German cockroach. And this is a reason why they're often preserved quite well in the fossil record. It's often quite easy to pick out the venations of these fossil insects. So in 2003, Ansog suggested that the most common cockroach from the Toarcian of Europe, known as Blattodea langfeldii, was actually able to fly quite long distances when compared with other taxa, such as the larger and actually more rarer cockroach, Coleoptera, which is the specimen on the left there, which is actually considered to be a comparatively poor flyer and probably infrequently left the ground. So caddisflies are insects of the order Trichoptera, and adult caddisflies are generally medium-sized insects with membranous hairy wings, which again are held in a tent-wise fashion when the insect is at rest, as you can see on the modern-day caddisfly. And within the fossil record, adult Trichoptera have quite a similar morphology to moths, which highlight their close relationship within Lepidoptera. Now, while Lepidoptera have layers of scales on their wings, Trichoptera usually have layers of hairs on their wings, and also this quite strong venation, which you can see in both the modern and Toarcian examples there. And Trichopterans from the early Mesozoic are again preserved as isolated wings. But as you can see with the fossil example on the left there from Sanem, this specimen is actually quite well preserved and quite complete. So it's really a beautiful example of these insects. So we've had a little insight into what insects would have been around during the Toarcian of Luxembourg there. I kind of brought this insect material to life, if you will, by comparing it with the modern day representatives. But what if we could extrapolate this? So instead of looking at just the Luxembourg material, what if we could extrapolate this and look at things like the type, abundance, and diversity of insect communities from other Toarcian horizons, either from within the UK or other parts of Europe, and perhaps even in other parts of the world, to see how these insects vary from location to location, or for example, by paleolatitude at this time. So why is this all important? Well, one of the reasons why it's important is if we can deduce where these Toarcian insect-bearing horizons are stratigraphically distributed and where they occur within the Toarcian event in relation to the negative carbon isotope excursion that we discussed earlier, we can potentially get a really good idea of how these insects were affected by the extreme environmental change of this time. Now, data presented from the Basserage section in Luxembourg suggests that this insect horizon occurs after the negative shift in the excursion. So you can see it here highlighted by the red box on the left there. So you can see this peak and then the carbon isotope, and then you can see the lenticular limestone bed just above that. So does this suggest that insects were greatly affected by the environmental change of the Toarcian event and maybe just couldn't survive in the aftermath? Are these insect beds showing us a mass dying event of these insects in response to this environmental perturbation? Or is this just simply all preservational? Well, it would be really interesting to conclude if all of these insect beds around Europe and even in other parts of the world occurred at the same time globally, which could potentially suggest a global stress on insects at one certain point in time. And one of my aims of my PhD is to collect more data from other sections to test this hypothesis if they're all occurring at the same time, and to determine the relationship between these insect horizons and the event of extreme environmental change to potentially answer these questions. So we've previously discussed that the Toarcian event is an analogue for potential extreme modern day global warming, and that the scale of the changes observed in this Toarcian event is comparable with global surface change temperature change prediction for 2100. So could it be that these insects from the early Jurassic period could give us a very vital clue as to how modern day insects will respond to current climate change in the future? Ultimately, could it be that the past is the key to understanding the present? Now, there's still undoubtedly a lot of questions to be answered here, but there's no doubt that I'm definitely looking forward to finding out the answers. So many thanks for listening, everyone. Welcome any questions or discussion. in regards to this PhD project, or actually any other research that I've been involved in. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Emily, for this excellent talk and this glimpse into the world of insects from the Toarcian. Ben, you are here. So
yes,
yeah, we have had in the chat, there was one question